The chamber held 312 species, and not one of them expected me to walk in. Without shaking, I felt it the moment. The great doors opened, that collective, almost amused certainty that the human was about to beg. The air inside the grand convocation hall of primes smelled like nothing I had words for, something between cold rain and ancient metal, and the low electrical hum of technologies so old they predated human language by several millennia. The ceiling was half a kilometer above my head, the seating rings curved upward in tiers so vast that the beings near the top were barely more than colored shapes, small pixels in a living painting that stretched higher than most buildings I had ever stood in. And every single one of those shapes was watching me walk to the small white platform at the center of the floor. My name is Marcus Vale. I am 44 years old. I'm a diplomat from Earth. And on that morning, I was the only human being within 11 light years. I carried one folder under my arm. Inside, it was a single document. I had read it exactly 6 years earlier in a basement office in Geneva while a winter storm knocked the power out twice and the backup lights turned everything the color of old paper. I had not opened that folder since. I did not need to. Every word of the document was arranged inside my head like furniture in a room I had lived in for so long that I no longer needed to look at it to know where everything was. I sat down at the platform and placed the folder on the desk in front of me. A glass of water had been set there by a council aide, small translucent being with 4 arms and no visible face, who had bowed to me. As I passed through the corridor, I thanked her. She seemed surprised by this. I was not certain whether her species had a physical gesture for surprise, but whatever she did with her upper arms in that moment looked very much like it. For the past 10 years, Earth had been under formal review by the Galactic Council, not a trial. Technically, the Council never used that word. They called it a civilizational assessment, which was a very long and very polished phrase for what it actually was: a judgment. A room full of ancient, powerful, and deeply organized civilizations deciding whether the newest, loudest, and most unpredictable species in the known galaxy was too dangerous to be permitted to exist alongside them freely. The charges, as I understood them after a decade of briefings and reports and late nights in quiet offices, were not entirely unreasonable. Humanity had a long history of large-scale internal conflict. We had developed weapons capable of destroying a planet's surface, and had on several well-documented occasions come closer than anyone liked to admit to using them on ourselves. We had recovered a council observation probe from our outer orbit in reverse, engineered it completely within 72 hours, a feat that no other species in council history had managed in fewer than 4 years. We expanded quickly. We learned quickly, and most alarming of all from the council's perspective, we were completely unpredictable in ways that their best modeling systems simply could not account for. Humanity behaved according to the formal assessments I had read like a variable that refused to stabilize. The proposed verdict was quarantine, permanent, total enforced isolation from all interstellar civilization, no trade agreements, no communications channels, a ring of suppressor buoys placed around our solar system, maintained indefinitely by council patrol vessels that would prevent any human craft from leaving in any foreign craft from entering, not. Forever, they said, the order would be reviewed in 500 years, but 500 years was more than enough time, 500 years of complete isolation without the resources, the partnerships, the knowledge exchange, and the expansion room that every thriving civilization needed to survive was a slow and extremely polite way of saying, you will not make it through this. Every species that had ever received a quarantine verdict in the Council's long history had eventually gone silent. The speaker of the hegemony delegation was a Sanathi named Vidara. He stood nearly 2 m tall. His skin was a deep blue-gray that seemed almost reflective under the chamber's overhead light, and he had 4 eyes arranged in a perfect horizontal line across his face. His voice when he spoke sounded like a cello being played at the bottom of a very still lake, rich and deep and carrying easily to every corner of the chamber without any apparent effort. When he addressed the hall at the opening of the session, every being in the room went quiet without being asked to, not out of fear, out of the natural response to a voice that had been doing this for a very long time. He did not look at me when he spoke. He looked at the chamber, at his peers, at the grand curved walls and the long banners of 300 civilizations hanging in carefully maintained stillness from the upper supports. He spoke about balance, about the fragile, carefully maintained peace that the Council had spent 10,000 years constructing. He spoke about the patterns of history and the specific documented cost of ignoring them. He spoke about how mercy, when extended to something that had not yet earned it, and when extended without proper safeguard, had a way of becoming something else entirely. He never used the word human. He said the assessed species throughout, every time without exception, as if giving us a name gave us a dignity that the evidence had not yet shown we deserved. I listened to every word. I took notes in a small paper notebook, actual paper which I had been told caused remarkable curiosity among several alien delegations who had never in their civilizational memory encountered a writing surface made from processed plant material. I did not interrupt, I did not argue. I wrote in small, neat letters, and I drank my water, and I breathed at a pace I had been deliberately maintaining since the moment the doors opened. A young council aide named Petra Halt, one of the 3 human Elsen staff who had been stationed on Ori Prime for the past 3 years, leaned close to me during a brief administrative pause between speakers and whispered that the chamber found my calmness unnerving. I thanked her for telling me. She asked if I was all right. I said I was tired and ready, both of which were true, and I asked her to return to her seat before the speaker noticed us talking. She hesitated for just a moment before she went. Petra had spent 8 months briefing me on the political landscape of the Council before we departed for Ori Prime. She was 29 years old, methodical in everything she did, and she had a habit of tapping her left thumb against her knee when she was processing something she found worrying. She had been tapping it since the moment I sat down. I had noticed, but I did not say anything to her about it. There was nothing useful I could offer in the way of reassurance, and I had a rule about offering words that were not useful. The formal reading of charges lasted 4 hours. Representatives from 17 different species took the speaking floor in sequence and presented their case. Against humanity, they showed recordings, they showed data models. They showed statistical projections of human population growth, resource consumption, and technological acceleration, and they presented something the Luminari delegation, a species whose first known cities predated the Cambrian explosion on Earth, called the Aggression Index. It was a numerical score compiled from the historical record of a civilization's willingness and frequency of using force as a first response tool. Humanity's score was the highest ever recorded in the index's history. The Luminari speaker was a small being wrapped in something that moved like pale smoke around her form, and she delivered this finding in a tone of genuine sadness. Rather than accusation, she said she held no personal position against humans. She said the data simply represented itself. She said that across the entirety of her species' long observational memory, the specific combination of rapid territorial expansion, high rates of internal conflict, and extreme technological adaptability had never once in any documented case ended well for the civilization surrounding the species. Question: she was not wrong about any of it. I knew she was not wrong. I wrote her key points down carefully in my notebook. At the conclusion of the 4 hours, Veldor announced that the human representative would be permitted to address the chamber. 12 minutes, the standard allocation for assessed species. His tone made the formality of this perfectly clear. It was a courtesy extended to something that had not yet earned courtesy because the council believed in following its own procedures to the letter, nothing more than that. I stood up. I picked up my folder. I walked to the central speaking position. 312 species watched me cross that floor. Some of them had been observing civilizations rise and fall for longer than my species had been making tools from stone. Some of them had watched 100 different representatives stand in this exact spot and plead or argue or weep or deliver long, passionate speeches that changed nothing at all. I looked out at the chamber, all those eyes, hundreds of different configurations of them, every color and shape that biology had developed across the full span of the galaxy. Every single one of them aimed at me. I did not feel small. I had prepared myself for it. I had expected to stand here and feel the weight of all of that history pressing down, the accumulated mass of 10,000 years of organized civilization. Looking at one human being and finding him inadequate, I had braced for it the way you brace for cold water, knowing it is coming, hoping the bracing is enough. Instead, standing there with the folder in my hands in the silence of the chamber around me, I felt something I had not anticipated at all. I felt completely unusually clear. I set the folder on the speaking podium. I did not open it. I said, "Thank you for the time," and then I began the night before, in my quarters on the delegate corridor, a narrow room with one window that looked out onto the outstretched arms of a spiral nebula so large it barely seemed real. I had sat with the document for a long time, not reading it, just sitting with it. The document was already inside me, every clause and subclause and procedural reference sitting in my memory like a map of a building I had been living in for years. I did not need to read it again. I sat with it because sometimes a person needs to be in the same physical space as the thing they are about to do, just to make sure the weight of it is correctly understood, Petra had knocked at my door at 11:00 in the evening and asked if I wanted company. I told her no, but thank you. She hesitated in the doorway the way she always did when she had something she wanted to say and was deciding whether to say it. Then she said very quietly, "Marcus, do you actually think this is going to work?" I sat with that question for a moment before answering. I think I said that the word work is doing a very large amount of heavy lifting in that question. She did not look reassured. I did not blame her for that. After she left, I stayed by the window for another 2 hours watching the nebula. It was green and gold at its outer edges and completely dark at its center. Darkness that absorbed the light around it completely. I had read something once about how nebulas were not actually empty at their hearts. They were full of gas and dust and the slow, patient building of something new, something that would eventually become a star. You could not see the star because it was not ready yet, but the materials were there, gathering, pressing together under their own weight, and in time, in a very, very long time, measured nothing that human beings had a natural vocabulary for, something would ignite. I thought about that for a while. Then I went asleep because I needed to be rested for the morning, and because there was nothing more I could prepare, and because the kind of fear that comes before something irreversible had been used up in me 6 years ago and had never found its way back. In the morning, I put on my suit, picked up my folder, and walked into a room where 312 species were waiting to decide whether humanity deserved a place among them. I had 12 minutes to answer that question. I planned to use 11, the last minute I was saving for the silence that I knew was coming, the silence I had decided 6 years ago was going to say the one thing that no prepared speech could. The first time the chamber went quiet in a way that felt meaningfully different from the usual formal quiet. I was 4 minutes into my address. Those 4 minutes had been spent doing something that no representative of an assessed species had ever done in the recorded history of the Grand Convocation Hall. I had agreed with them partially, not in the polished, careful, diplomatic way that involves saying, while we acknowledge the concerns raised before, rotating smoothly into a list of counterpoints. I had agreed clearly, directly, thoroughly, and without any visible sign of distress. Yes, I told the chamber, humanity had a long and well-documented history of large-scale internal conflict. Yes, the aggression index score the luminary had presented was accurate as far as we could verify it against our own historical data. Yes, we had reverse-engineered the council probe in 72 hours, and I would add, for the sake of complete transparency, that our engineers had also produced 3 improved versions of the same probe within the following month, a detail that had not appeared in the official report filed against us. Yes, our expansion curve was steep by Galactic standards. Yes, our technological acceleration was measured by any reasonable metric alarming to observe. From the outside, all of it was true. I agreed with all of it. The chamber did not know how to respond to this. I could see it happen in real time. The collective uncertainty that moved through the room like a change in air pressure, beings shifting slightly in their seats, translation devices buzzing with a new intensity as delegations checked and rechecked that they had received the correct interpretation of what the human was saying. The Kthvari. Representative, a broad-armored being, whose people had a documented tradition of physical deterrence and whose voice sounded like two large stones being ground together, leaned forward from his elevated position in the third tier and studied me with what could only read as profound confusion. He had been the fourth speaker in the charges portion of the session and had presented what was, by all measures, the harshest collection of evidence against humanity that the day had produced. He looked now like a person who had spent considerable time preparing a very thorough argument and had arrived to find that his opponent had already admitted to everything before the room had settled, but I had not admitted to everything. That distinction was the part they had not yet caught up to. I placed my hands flat on the speaking podium and I said, the question before this council is not whether humanity is dangerous. We are dangerous, that has been established. The question is whether this council has correctly understood the nature of what it is dealing with and whether the action being proposed today will produce the outcome it is designed to prevent. The buzzing stopped. The chamber was very still. I had 7 minutes and 40 seconds remaining. I continued. 40 years ago I told them Earth initiated a program. It was not a military program. It was not in the traditional understanding of the word an exploratory one either. It was something more patient than those things, more deliberate and more thorough than anything the council had thought to look for, because it did not have the surface characteristics of what a young and aggressive species would choose to do. From the outside, from any reasonable analytical perspective, it looked like science, it looked like archiving, it looked like a species doing the responsible and rather modest work of preserving its culture and knowledge against the possibility of its own eventual extinction. That is exactly what it was. It was also at the same time something else. Over the course of 4 decades, I told them, working without announcement, without fanfare, and without transmitting any communication that could be intercepted, it incorrectly decoded as what it actually represented. Humanity had designed, constructed, and quietly launched a network of self-replicating autonomous probes, very small in physical dimension, very quiet in every detectable frequency, very patient. Their programming, each probe carried a complete and comprehensive record of human knowledge, science, language, art, music, biological data recorded, history, mathematics, architecture, philosophy, medicine, engineering, literature, and the accumulated problem-solving methodology developed by 8 billion people across 1,000 years of recorded civilization. Each probe had been given one instruction regarding where to go and one instruction regarding when to activate. Destinations were star systems, 1,200 of them distributed across 11 sectors of the galaxy, including, and here I paused and I let the pause sit in the air of the chamber for a full 3 seconds, which is a very long time in a room that size, including systems currently within the territorial boundaries of 11-member species of this council. The probes were dormant. They had one trigger condition: a quarantine verdict against Earth. The chamber did not erupt. It did the precise opposite. It compressed itself into a silence so complete that the sounds filling the space were things I had not noticed before. My own steady breathing, the faint climate control hum from the walls, and somewhere in the Upper tiers, very high and very distant. The small, careful sound of something being set down on a hard surface by hands that had gone very still. Dura was looking directly at me. His 4 eyes had not moved in any direction. From the moment I had spoken the number 1200, he had been motionless in a way I had not observed in him before, even during his opening address, which had been a masterwork of composed formal authority. He had moved with the natural small, fluid grace of his species, slight turns of the head, small precise gestures of his hands to mark rhetorical points. Now he was entirely still. He looked like an image of himself. I said, I want to be precise about what these probes are not. They are not weapons. They carry no destructive capability in any form. They cannot be adapted into weapons. Their function is entirely archival and communicative. If the quarantine verdict passes today, the probes will activate within 72 hours and begin transmitting their contents, every piece of human knowledge, every cultural artifact, every scientific finding, every expression of what humanity has been and thought and built and loved over 1,000 years of recorded history will become a permanent and freely accessible part of the galactic record. It will be embedded within the infrastructure of member civilizations. It will be archived inside their systems. It will be integrated with their networks and their libraries and their data banks permanently, without the possibility of removal. I let that rest in the room for a moment, then I said, you cannot quarantine what is already inside your walls. Petra had asked me once during a long evening in the briefing room about 6 months before we left for Ori Prime whether I felt guilty about the plan. She had asked it directly and without preamble, the way she asked most things that mattered to her, looking across the table at me while she turned her coffee cup slowly in both hands. I had thought about it before answering. I told her that guilt properly understood requires a better available alternative, and that I had spent a considerable amount of time looking for one and had not found it. She had nodded slowly. She said they were going to call it a threat. I said, yes, some of them would, she said. But is it? And I said that the answer to that question depends entirely on what you mean by the word threat. We had sat with that for a while. The room was quiet except for the building's ventilation. Outside it had been raining. The truth was that no single word could hold what we had done without distorting it. Humanity had not sent those probes as a weapon. We had sent them as the most honest expression we had of something fundamental to our nature, the refusal to vanish quietly. The probes existed because we had looked at the history of quarantine verdicts, studied each one carefully, tracked every species that had received one, and reached a conclusion that was neither complicated nor disputable. Isolation was not mercy. It was a long and courteous and completely irreversible end. We had been unwilling to accept that end, not because we wanted to impose ourselves on a galaxy that had not asked for us, but because we had decided, after 40 years of very careful thinking, that the only real alternative to engagement was silence, and we had too many things to say to choose silence voluntarily. Was that aggression? Some in the chamber would say yes. I would have argued it was something else, the most recognizably human thing we had ever done as a species, finding the one door that had not been locked and walking through it before anyone thought to check. That was not violence, that was Just a very old and very reliable human. Habit back in the chamber. The silence had held for nearly 22 seconds before it broke. The first voice was not. It came from the upper tiers, from the Vithara delegation. The Vithara were a small, silver-skinned people known above all other qualities for their precise, literal, and completely unsentimental interpretation of council law in a political body built on ceremony and layers of procedural tradition. The Vithara were the species that read every footnote and cited every subclause. Their representative, a compact being, with a voice that carried no inflection of any kind, asked 2 questions in sequence without waiting for responses. Between them, are these probes currently present in member territory star systems? Yes, I said, and they cannot be recalled or deactivated by any external party. No, I said, they cannot. There was a pause. The Vithara representative said, with the same flat precision they used for everything. Then the council has a procedural problem. Veldar said. The council has nothing of the sort. His voice was controlled, deep, composed, but something had entered it that had not been there during his opening address. Particular quality of tightness, the sound of a very large and very capable mind working through something faster than it would prefer to. What the council has is a deliberate provocation, and the human representative will immediately retract this statement and submit to, I said as calmly as I could manage. I cannot retract a fact. Chamber buzzed. It was a different kind of buzz from anything that had come before, sharper and less organized. The sound of 300 delegations all reaching for the same thought at the same time, and none of them finding it quickly. I had 3 minutes remaining. I used them. I told the council that at the moment I began my address, I had transmitted a secondary document through the pre-authorized relay protocol. This process was available to all assessed species representatives under Article 7, Section 14 of the Galactic Council Convocation Code. It permitted any representative to submit supporting documentation to all council elders simultaneously at any point during active formal proceedings without requiring advanced approval from the speaker or any presiding official. The document had gone out the moment I opened my mouth. It had been received by all relevant parties. Dura said that no document had been authorized for submission. I said with every respect I could produce that Article 7, Section 14 did not require prior authorization. It required that the document be transmitted during a formal session, that it be addressed to the elders directly, and that it travel through the secure council relay channel. All 3 conditions had been satisfied at the moment of transmission. Velvedara turned to look at one of his aides. The aide looked at a screen. What happened to the aide's expression in the following 2 seconds was something I had seen before on the face of a junior colleague in Geneva who had discovered in the final review stage that a document had already been signed and distributed and contained a line that could not now be taken back. It was not quite panic. It was the expression of someone who has just confirmed that a thing they hoped was not true is in fact true. The document had been received. I said I request a 2-hour recess so that the council elders may review the document before the vote is cast. This is also specifically permitted under the Convocation Code. There was a long pause. Dara looked at me. His 4 eyes made a slow, sweeping movement across my face as if he were taking a careful inventory of something he had previously catalogued incorrectly. Then he said, "You have prepared this with considerable care." I said we had 40 years. He held the look for another moment, then he turned and called for 2-hour recess. It was the first unscheduled recess called during a quarantine assessment in 612 years of council records. Sat down at my desk. I picked up the glass of water that had been there since the session began. I drank what remained in it. Petra came to my shoulder. She did not sit down immediately. She stood at the edge of my platform and looked at me the way she had looked at nothing else all morning. That complete focused attention of a person who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and is still slightly disbelieving that it has. She said almost too quietly for me to hear. "Marcus," I said. "I know," she said. "They're going to be furious," I said. "Some of them will be. Others are going to be something different." She waited. I set the empty glass down, interested. I said, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely interested in what humans have to say for themselves. Outside the sealed walls of the chamber, somewhere in 11 star systems spread across 11 sectors of a galaxy that had been making decisions about humanity without humanity's meaningful input. For a decade, very small and very silent and very patient probes were floating in the dark, waiting for the only signal that would ever matter to them. I folded my hands. I waited too. I should explain something about the Cathari testimony that I glossed over in the chamber when their representative took the floor. Earlier that morning, he had not simply read statistics into the record. He had shown footage, long detailed, carefully selected archival recordings of the worst chapters in human history, compiled from our own public broadcast records and news archives, material that humanity had documented about itself with the particular honest unsentimentality that comes from a species which has learned through many painful iterations that pretending bad things did not happen does not make them not have happened. The footage ran for 22 minutes. The chamber watched it all. I watched it with them. I did not look away. I had seen these recordings before, most of them in various forms, in various contexts. Every human diplomat assigned to the council track had been required to review the likely evidentiary submissions as part of their preparation. But watching it here in this chamber, surrounded by 300 species who had never caused each other anything approaching what those images contained, was a different experience from watching it in a briefing room in Geneva. At no point did I argue with what I was seeing. At no point did I reach for the instinct to contextualize or explain or soften. I watched and I wrote in my notebook and I thought about something that occurred to me for what was probably the 100th time since I had taken this assignment, that the most remarkable thing about humanity was not the violence. The violence was explicable. The violence was a function of biology and resource scarcity and the particular social pressures of a species that had spent 95% of its existence competing at the level of the individual and the small group before suddenly, in evolutionary terms, being asked to organize itself at the scale of billions. The remarkable thing was that we were still here. Every one of those disasters in the footage had been an end. Every one of them had looked from the inside like the last chapter, and every single time something in us had refused to let it be. Not because we were noble, not because we were wise, because we were stubborn in a way that, apparently, nothing in the galaxy had quite prepared for. I thought about that while I watched the footage, and I thought about it while the chamber went very quiet around me, and I thought about it when the Kithvari representative finished and sat down with the satisfied bearing of someone who believes they have made their argument conclusively. I wrote in my notebook, they are showing the galaxy what we have survived. They think they are showing the galaxy why we should be stopped. They are not wrong that those are the same images. They are wrong about which conclusion follows from them. 3 species approached me during the first break between testimony segments. I will not name them because the conversations were offered in something that functioned as confidence. What they all said in different phrasings was the same thing. They had always found humanity interesting. They had read human literature and studied human science, and some of their younger researchers had been quietly corresponding with human universities. For years, they would be voting for quarantine anyway, not because they wanted to, because the political cost of opposing it was higher than they were currently positioned to pay. I thanked all 3 of them. I meant it. I understood completely. Political cost is a real thing. I had no interest in pretending otherwise. What none of them knew, because no one outside a very small group of people on Earth knew, was that their vote, whatever it turned out to be, had already been rendered substantially irrelevant by the contents of the secondary document they had not yet read. That was perhaps the loneliest part of the whole morning, sitting in a room full of beings who were making the best decisions they had available to them, not knowing that the situation they were deciding inside had already been changed by something they could not see. I understood how they felt in a different way. Humanity had been in that position for a decade when Dara called the recess and the chamber began to empty and reorganize itself into the urgent, clustered conversations of 300 delegations, all trying to understand what had just happened. I noticed a young aide from the Luminari delegation standing at the edge of my platform. She was very small, even by Luminari standards, and she was holding a data pad to her chest, the way a person holds something they are trying to decide whether to set down. She said in the careful translated approximation of Galactic standard that the earpiece produced, the speaker of the Luminari delegation would like to know if the human representative would be willing to speak with her, not officially, during the recess. I said yes. She nodded and left. The Luminari speaker found me the small observation room they had assigned me 20 minutes into the recess. She came without aides, which surprised me. She was the same small, smoke-wrapped figure who had delivered the aggression index findings that morning, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, as if she was confirming something. She said, "You agreed with everything we said." I said most of it was accurate. She said, "No species under assessment has ever agreed with the charges." I said, "That is because most species under assessment believe that agreeing with the charges const the argument. I believe the opposite." She was quiet for a moment. Her form moved in the way that the Luminari moved when they were thinking, a slow shifting of the light within them, like clouds crossing a sky from the inside. She said, "The probes, you truly believe they are not a weapon?" I said, "I know They are not a weapon, she said. Others will call them one, I said. Yes, and the moment one of them explains to me precisely how a library of human art and mathematics and medical knowledge constitutes an instrument of harm, I will take that argument seriously. She looked at me for a long time. Her species was so old that the concept of a long look from them carried a weight that it did not carry from younger beings. When the luminari looked at something, they were drawing on an observational history that predated any other living record, she said. Eventually, you are not what we expected, I said. We rarely are, she left without saying anything else. I sat in the room and finished the food on the tray and watched the chamber below me through the glass where the galaxy was, trying to work out what to do with the one species that had been completely certain it understood. The 2 hours of recess felt like 2 different kinds of time happening simultaneously inside the same body. In one sense, they felt very long, every minute of sitting in that small observation room off the main hall, watching the chamber floor below through the glass, watching 300 delegations reorganize themselves into urgent clusters and scatter and reform. And scatter again had a quality of stretched out deliberateness, like time that knew it was being observed and was performing accordingly. In another sense, they were over before I had finished deciding what to do with them. The council elders had retired to their sealed chamber immediately after Vel Dara called the recess, that room a space I had only ever seen in architectural diagrams and council history texts, had not been entered by any representative of an assessed species in the entire recorded history of the institution. What happened inside, it was known to no one outside it until the elders chose to speak. That had always been a deliberate design principle of the council. The final deliberations of its most senior representatives were protected. Absolutely no recording, no testimony, no external review of any kind. What that meant in practical terms was that for 2 hours the people who were going to decide the future of humanity were in a room I could not see, reading a document I had sent them, and I had no way to know what any of them were thinking. I found that surprisingly calming. There was nothing to do. The thing was either going to work or it was not, and nothing I did in the next 2 hours would change the document they had already received, or law it cited, or the probes already sitting dormant in 11 star systems across the galaxy. I had done everything that was available to be done. What remained was simply time passing. I ate the food on the tray. I drank water. I made notes in my notebook about things I wanted to communicate back to team in Geneva after the session ended. Regardless of how it ended, Petra found me 18 minutes into the recess. She had her tablet in her left hand and the particular compressed energy of someone who has been receiving information faster than their ability to categorize it. She sat down across from me without being asked and said, "The KEVARI elder has called for an emergency legal review of the probe deployment. Their position is that it represents a preemptive act of cultural intrusion on member territories." That was expected, I said. The Luminari have not said anything publicly. I noted that the Vithra have pulled their full legal staff from their current projects and assigned them entirely to Article 7 research. They have also formally requested through the Council Archives Office the original text of the quarantine addendum. She paused the version from 7,000 years ago. I said nothing. I ate a small piece of the food on the tray. Petra watched me for a moment, then she said, "You knew about the addendum. I read it 6 years ago," I said, "in the basement in Geneva." "Yes," she turned her tablet over in her hands. This was a different nervous habit from the thumb-tapping one she used when she was processing something that felt larger than the room she was sitting in. She said, "Vara is requesting a private meeting. His aide is outside the corridor." I looked up from my food when immediately from the sound of it, I considered this for a moment. Dara requesting a private meeting with a human representative during a quarantine assessment recess was something that had not happened before. The significance of it could cut in more than one direction. He might be coming to deliver a formal warning. He might be coming to try to find some procedural mechanism for undoing what I had done. He might simply be coming because, after 140 years on the council, he had encountered something that did not fit any of his existing models, and he wanted to look at it more closely. Any of those possibilities were workable. "Tell the aide I will be there in 5 minutes," I said. Petra stood up. She held her tablet against her chest, the way the luminary aide had held her data pad earlier, with both hands, as if it were something requiring that kind of care. She looked at me for a moment, and I could see her deciding the same way. She always decided whether to say the thing she was thinking. This time she did not say it. She nodded and left. I sat for the 5 minutes. I did not rehearse anything. I had spent 6 years rehearsing, and the time for that was finished. What I had to say to Dara, if he asked anything I already knew. I thought instead about Nora, about the morning I left. She had been standing in the departure terminal at 4 in the morning because she had insisted on coming to see me off, and no amount of reasonable argument about early departure times had changed her mind about that. She was 11 years old, and she had the particular stubborn quality that runs through our family, the way a vein of metal runs through stone, not visible until you press against it, and then unmistakably there. She had asked me to explain one more time why I had to go. I had told her the truth, which was that they were very old and very powerful beings far away, who had decided that our whole family, every last one of us, was too complicated to live next to freely, and so they wanted to build a wall around our house and bolt the gate and say, "Stay in there where we can watch you and where you cannot surprise us," not to hurt us, just to contain us. But a bolted gate is still a bolted gate, and a family that cannot reach out and grow and connect to the world around it eventually stops being fully alive. Not all at once, just slowly, year by year, the way a plant stops being alive when you leave it in a room with no light. Nora had listened to this very carefully. Then she asked what I was going to do about it. I told her I took a long time finding a door that was still unlocked, not to sneak away, to stay, to make it so that removing us from the neighborhood would require dismantling so much of the neighborhood itself that no one would seriously want to do it. And the way I had found to do that was not through force, because force was the thing they were already expecting from us and had already prepared for. It was through something older and stranger, and in some ways braver than force. She had thought about this for a long time. Then she said, "That's sneaky." I had said, "That's human." She laughed. It was the last sound I heard before I walked through The gate and the automated doors closed. Behind me, Dara was in the antechamber. When I arrived, he was alone. The Sanathi almost never moved without aides. Informal council space, which told me that whatever this meeting was, he had decided it was not for the record. He was standing at the window that looked out onto the nebula, his hands behind his back, and he did not turn when I came in. I sat down in one of the chairs and waited. After a moment he turned. He studied me with all four of his eyes, in a way that was different from how he had looked at me across the chamber. There his attention had been the measured professional attention of a very experienced diplomat observing a variable he had not yet fully categorized. Here it was something more direct, more personal, the attention of a being who had genuinely been surprised and was not used to that feeling. He said, "What you have done is without precedent in this institution." I said, "Many things are without precedent until they happen." He said, "You have placed this council in a position that has no clean resolution." I said, "I have placed this council in an honest position. Those two things are sometimes the same and sometimes they are not." He moved to sit across from me. He sat with the same deliberate economy of movement that I had observed all morning, result of a very long lifetime of learning not to waste anything. He said, "The probes are genuinely in member systems. This is not a claim, it is not a claim." I said, "It is a fact, and they cannot be recalled, they cannot." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I counted 34 seconds in my head before he spoke again. He said, "If the verdict passes, they will activate. Yes, in 72 hours, and every archive of human knowledge, language, science, art, mathematics, and biological record will become a permanent, embedded component of the infrastructure of 11 member civilizations. You cannot quarantine species whose culture is already living inside your own systems. The quarantine order as a practical matter would be unenforceable from the moment of its passage." Veldar looked at the table between us, then at me. "You are describing the integration of foreign material into member territories without their consent or knowledge." I said, "I am describing the permanent free distribution of human knowledge to any civilization whose systems received it. It cannot harm anyone. It cannot be turned into anything that harms anyone. It is completely, literally nothing except information, art, science, language, history, mathematics, the record of 8 billion people who spent 1,000 years learning, sometimes very badly, how to survive alongside each other." I paused for a moment. "If your definition of an unlawful act includes the unsolicited provision of music, I am not sure how to address that." Something moved in Veldar's face. It was small and brief, and I could not precisely identify it, but I was certain it was not anger. Whatever it was something that anger had been sitting on top of for the past 2 hours and had briefly slipped past. He said, "The secondary document contains more than the details of the probe network." "Yes," I said, "it contains a legal reference. Article 7 of the Quarantine Addendum," I said, "from the original Convocation Code, ratified in the period your records designate the Consolidation Era, specifically the subclause addressing civilizations whose cultural material, biological data, or infrastructure presence has become integrated with the territory of 2 or more council member species prior to the formal enactment of A quarantine verdict, that subclause, does not merely complicate the verdict. It triggers an automatic institutional review, not a review of the specific verdict, a review of the council itself. As a governing body, the review cannot be bypassed, it cannot be suspended, pending other proceedings. It takes between 3 and 7 years to complete during which under the same code no quarantine verdict against the triggering species can be formally enacted. DARA did not move. You cannot enforce a quarantine against a species that is already integrated into the member territories of the institution issuing the order, I said, without first completing a review process that your own founding documents require. That is not a loophole, it is a structural provision. It was written by your founders. It has simply never been relevant until now, he said very quietly. Where did you find that clause? In your public archives, I said, which are technically accessible to anyone, though the indexing system is not particularly user-friendly. It took one of our researchers 4 years to locate the original text in the consolidation era records. It took me 1 afternoon to understand precisely what it meant in the present context. A long silence. Then he said, "You have been building toward this for a very long time." I said, "We have been doing what humans have always done when they encounter problem that cannot be solved through force. We refuse to stop thinking about it until we found another way in." He rose from his chair. He stood at his full height in the small room, that deep blue-gray of his skin catching the light from the window, those 4 eyes now completely unreadable in any framework I had been trained to work within. I did not know what he was going to do. I genuinely did not know. And that uncertainty was the most honest thing I had felt since I walked into the chamber. He said, "I have served on this council for 140 years. I have personally overseen 4 quarantine assessments. I have seen 11 species stand in that chamber and hear that verdict read against them." He paused. "Not one of them did what you have done," I said. "Not one of them was human." He held the look for one more moment, that long, careful inventory of something he had previously filed incorrectly. Then he walked to the door. Before he opened it, he stopped. He did not turn around. He said so quietly that I had to sit very still to hear it properly. "The vote will proceed as scheduled." I said, "I know it will." He left. I sat in the small room by the window for a while longer. The nebula was the same green and gold at its edges, the same deep dark at its center. From this angle at this hour, the dark center looked slightly less absolute, or perhaps that was just the light changing, the way light changes when you are sitting still long enough to notice it. I had 8 billion people behind me who did not know they were waiting. 8 billion people doing the ordinary work of a Tuesday, eating breakfast and arguing with their children and catching transport and meeting deadlines and falling asleep over their work, none of them knowing that in a sealed room on a space station at the edge of the mapped galaxy, the most consequential Tuesday in human history was happening without their knowledge. I hoped I was getting it right. I thought I was. I got up, straightened my jacket, and walked back to the main chamber to wait for the session to resume. There was one more thing that happened during that recess, and I have not told it in the order it occurred, because the order it occurred does not do justice to the weight of it. I need to tell it now, because without it, the rest of the story is missing. something that matters, while I was sitting in the observation room before Petra arrived with her updates in. Before the aide from Vidara came to the corridor, I received a message through the human delegation relay. It was from a man named Colin Marsh, who was 72 years old and who had spent the last 31 years as the lead coordinator of the program. He was not a public figure. He did not have a political title. He was an engineer and a project manager, and the person who had over 3 decades of careful and methodical work turned a theoretical plan into 1,200 physical objects currently floating in the dark across 11 sectors of the galaxy. The message was 4 words. It said they are all awake, which meant the probes had received the preliminary activation signal, the one that put them into standby rather than sleep, the one that could be sent at my discretion to indicate that the trigger event was approaching without actually triggering them. I had sent that signal 2 hours before I walked into the chamber from the secure relay in my quarters as the last thing I did before I put my jacket on. Colin was telling me they had received it, all 1,200 of them, across 11 sectors of the galaxy, 1,200 very small and very patient pieces of human ingenuity were awake and waiting. I had not replied to his message. There was nothing to say that he did not already know, but I had sat with it for a while, thinking about him, about the 31 years he had put into something he would never be publicly recognized for, that most of humanity would never know about, working in facilities that did not officially exist, on budgets that did not appear on any public record, building the most ambitious insurance policy in human history with a team of people who had all understood from the beginning that the work was not for themselves, it was for everyone else, the 8 billion people on Tuesday who did not know this Tuesday was different from any other. That kind of work requires a particular quality of person, not brilliance exactly, though Colin and his team were certainly brilliant. Patience, the specific, sustained, unshowy patience of someone who is willing to spend 31 years on a project whose results they may never personally see, because the project matters more than the seeing of it. Colin Marsh was the most human person I knew. I sent him 1 word back: ready. Then I put the communicator in my pocket and went to meet Dara, the thing I did not say to Dara because it was not the right moment and because it would not have served any purpose in that conversation, was the thing I believed most deeply about the entire situation. I believed, and had believed for 6 years, that the council was not wrong about humanity. They had looked at us accurately. They had seen what we were. They had drawn from that observation the conclusion that any careful, risk-averse, long-established governing body would draw from the same data. What they had missed was not visible in the data. What they had missed was what all that history had produced in us, not wisdom necessarily, not something stranger and more useful than those things, an absolute, constitutionally embedded, biologically reinforced refusal to stop trying, to stop finding new angles, to stop turning problems over and over in our hands at 3:00 in the morning in lit-up rooms until something fell out of them that had not been visible from any of the previous angles. The council had looked at our history and seen the destruction. They had not looked long enough to see what survived it every single time. That was the thing the aggression index could not measure. It had no metric for the species that kept getting up. I thought about this as I walked back to the main chamber, through the delicate corridor with its banners and its precisely maintained climate and its faint smell of cold metal, past aides and representatives from a dozen species who watched me pass, with expressions I could not fully read. I thought we are about to make it very difficult for this galaxy to look away from us for the next 1,000 years. I thought that is probably exactly what it needs. I walked back into the chamber, and I sat down at my desk and I folded my hands and I waited for the session to begin again. And I was in that moment very afraid and very ready and very proud of every stubborn person who had ever refused to stop the chamber reconvene to a sound it had never made before. I know this because Petra told me afterward with the particular certainty of someone who had spent 3 years on Ori Prime listening to the sounds the Grand Convocation Hall made in various states of session and recess and procedural dispute. She said she had never heard it sound like this, not during the previous 2 quarantine assessments she had observed, not during the emergency session the previous year, when 2 member species had disputed territorial boundaries with enough heat that the elders had needed to intervene 3 times in a single day. Not ever. What she was describing was not noise. Exactly. It was the absence of the particular quality of noise that the chamber normally had, the layered, purposeful hum of a room that knows what is about to happen and is prepared for it. What it had now was something rarer than that, a charged, compressed uncertainty, the sound of 300 delegations sitting with a question I did not yet have an answer to. When I walked back to my platform, the sound shifted, not louder, not quieter. It shifted the way sound shifts when the thing everyone in a room has been watching for finally moves. I sat down. I set my folder on the desk. I did not open it. Everything that needed to happen had already been set in motion. The folder was history now. What remained was procedure. Dara took the speaker's position at the front of the chamber. His bearing was precisely as composed as it had been at the opening of the session, that deep formal authority of a being who had been doing this for a very long time and who understood the value of performing composure, even when composure required effort. He called the session to order. He called for the vote. The voting procedure was direct. Each elder delegation's designated speaker announced their vote in sequence. Tally registered on the central column above the chamber floor in a numeral system readable by every species present. I watched the column behind me. In the human delegation area, Petra was absolutely still. The votes came in quickly. The elders had spent 2 hours making their decisions, and none of them were uncertain about what they had decided. 19 voted for quarantine. 14 voted against. 4 abstained. The total was final. The verdict had passed. The chamber made a sound. It was a long, slow murmur that moved through the tiers, from the lowest to the highest. Not quite the sound of celebration and not quite the sound of relief. Something more ambiguous and heavier than either. It was the sound of a decision landing in a room that was not entirely sure what the decision meant anymore and knew it was not sure and was sitting with that uncertainty in plain sight. Veldar stood. He straightened fully to his height. He opened the formal proclamation document, the same text that had been read at every quarantine Verdict in council history, unchanged. Its essential language across thousands of years, carrying in every syllable the full accumulated weight of an institution that had been governing interstellar civilization since before humanity had invented the wheel. He began to read. He got to the third line. He stopped. It was not a large stop, to anyone not specifically watching for it. It would have appeared as nothing more than a slight natural pause in the formal cadence of the reading, but I had studied the transcripts of 7 previous quarantine proclamations, and I knew the cadence of the third line, and what Valera produced was not the natural cadence. It was the pause of a mind hitting something it had known intellectually was coming, and nonetheless experiencing the full weight of it at the moment of contact. The third line of the standard quarantine proclamation read, said quarantine to be enacted against all cultural, biological, and formational extensions of the assessed species within the jurisdiction of the Galactic Council. All cultural, biological, and formational extensions within the jurisdiction, if the probes were in member systems, their contents were within council jurisdiction, which meant the proclamation was ordering the council to quarantine material that already existed inside the council's own member territories under the addendum subclause. This did not merely complicate the verdict. It triggered the institutional review automatically, without any additional action required by any party, without any possibility of override or suspension, because the founding documents of the council did not contain a mechanism for overriding the institutional review trigger. The founders had not included one because they had not imagined anyone would ever need to. The founders had not imagined humanity. Dara had known this was coming. He had known it since our private meeting, and before that since he read the secondary document in the Elder's chamber. The 2 hours of recess had given him time to fully understand it, to consult with the council's senior legal staff to confirm what the Vithara legal team had already confirmed, which was that the subclause was valid, was active, was not subject to selective application, and had been satisfied by the combination of the prob's current locations and the passage of the quarantine verdict. He had called the vote anyway. He had said the vote would proceed, and it had, because Dara was, among his many qualities, someone who believed in following procedure to its end, even when the end was uncomfortable. Perhaps especially when the end was uncomfortable. Now he was standing at the front of the chamber of the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, reading a proclamation that had already, the moment it reached the third line, triggered a legal mechanism that would prevent itself from being enacted. The pause lasted less than a second. Then the Vithara elder stood up. Vithara did not stand up during proceedings without being given the floor. This was not a matter of personal preference or individual temperament. It was a cultural absolute, a procedural commitment so deeply embedded in their civilizational identity that it functioned essentially as biology. The Vithara did not interrupt. They did not rise uninvited. They spoke when called upon and not before. The sight of their elder rising without permission stopped the room in a way that nothing else could have. A collective physical stillness passed through the chamber, from the floor to the highest tier, every being present processing the same signal simultaneously. Something is happening that is outside the normal parameters of this institution, the Vithra elder spoke in their characteristic cadence, flat and precise and carrying neither warmth nor coldness, a voice designed entirely for the accurate transmission of information. They said for the formal record, the Vithara delegation confirms that the legal analysis contained in the secondary document submitted by the human representative this session has been independently verified by our legal staff using primary counsel archive materials. The addendum trigger condition has been satisfied. The council is legally obligated under its own founding documents to initiate institutional review before clears throat. The quarantine verdict against the assessed species can be formally enacted. This obligation cannot be suspended, delayed, or selectively applied. It is a structural provision of the founding code. The chamber did not erupt in the way that the phrase chamber erupts usually implies. It did something more like imploding outward, a contained explosion of sound and movement that stayed within the formal boundaries of the space while simultaneously transforming every energy in it. 3 elders spoke in rapid sequence, overlapping in ways that the translation systems were not entirely designed to handle. One argued that the addendum subclause was functionally obsolete, having remained unactivated for the entirety of recorded council history, and that obsolescence constituted a de facto suspension. Another pointed out with great precision that the council's own constitutional framework drew a clear distinction between a provision that had been formally repealed and one that had simply not been relevant until now, and that the addendum subclause had not been repealed. A third elder end. This was the moment, the specific moment. I had spent 6 years trying to create the conditions for stated formally and for the record that the Kethvari delegation was withdrawing its support for the quarantine verdict pending legal resolution of the institutional review question. Then the Luminari withdrew their support. Then the Marathi withdrew theirs. The tally column above the floor shifted. 19 became 16, then 13, then 9. The quarantine verdict did not fall in a single dramatic moment. It dissolved slowly and then all at once, and then completely through the specific mechanism of an institution discovering that it had issued an order that conflicted with its own founding structure, and that the only available response to that conflict, according to the same founding structure, was to suspend the order pending review. The review under the consolidation era timeline would take between 3 and 7 years, during which no quarantine verdict against humanity could be enacted. It took 40 minutes from the moment the Vithara elder stood to the formal announcement, all proceedings suspended pending mandatory institutional review, quarantine verdict unenforceable pending review completion, human delegation to remain on Ori Prime for the preliminary assessment period. When the announcement came, the chamber was quieter than it had been at any moment in the entire session, not relieved, not celebratory, quiet in the way that very large things become quiet when they have just changed in a way that everyone in the room understands will require a long time to fully map. I sat at my plat stand. I did not speak, had nothing left to add that the process had not already said more clearly than I could have. Petra sat down beside me. She did not speak immediately. She looked at the chamber for a while, watching the 300 delegations in their various states of adjustment, and then she looked at me and she said it worked. I said the process worked, she said. Marcus, I said, I mean it. If it had been me, if it had been clever words or perfect timing or even the probes alone, they would have found a way around it. Within a generation, changed the law, found an exception, created a new category, but it was not me, it was 40 years of people doing careful work, and it was a legal clause written by the council's own founders that the council forgot to update, and it was a proclamation read in the same words for thousands of years, encountering one condition the founders had thought to plan for, and their descendants had thought to forget. None of that is me. I just showed up and read the room. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your daughter is going to be very proud of you." I thought about Nora about 4:00 in the morning in the departure terminal, and the way she had said that word with that tone. I took out my communicator. 40 minutes to Earth and 40 minutes back meant I would not receive a response for over an hour. I opened a message. I typed one word, home. I sent it. Then I set the communicator on the desk and watched the galaxy begin the long, slow, necessary work of figuring out what to do with us. In the upper tier, the luminary speaker was looking at me. I met her eyes. After a moment she raised one small translucent hand, not a greeting exactly, something more like acknowledgement, something more like, "I see you." I inclined my head. She lowered her hand. I thought about Colin Marsh and his facility that did not officially exist, and the 31 years he had given to 1,200 probes, and how he would receive the news today. I thought about all the people at the other end of 40 years of patient, invisible work who would never be known for it, who had done it anyway because the work was larger than the knowing. I thought, this is what humans do when you tell them no. We find the unlocked door, we walk through it, we stay. I want to tell you what happened in the hours after the formal announcement, because most accounts of significant events describe the event and not the afternoon that follows it. And the afternoon that follows it is where you actually learn what the event meant. The first thing that happened was that Veldar walked off the speaker's platform, crossed the floor of the chamber without stopping to speak to anyone, and left through the side corridor that led to the hegemony delegation suite. He did not look at me. As he passed my platform, I did not take that personally. He had a great deal to think about, and a Sanathi who had just had their authority substantially complicated by a procedural clause they had not known was still active, did not owe me a parting glance. The second thing that happened was that the Kethvari representative came to my platform. He stood at the edge of it for a moment before speaking, which I had come to understand was a Kethvari indication of a certain kind of difficulty, the difficulty of a person who wants to say something they have not entirely decided how to frame. He said in his slow, grinding voice, "The Kthvari position remains that the probe deployment was an intrusion." I said, "I understand." He said, "We will be challenging the legal interpretation of the addendum sub-clause during the review." I said, "That is your right, and I expect you to exercise it thoroughly." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Your mathematics was sound." I looked at him. He said, "The probe network, the distribution, the integration threshold required to activate the addendum trigger, your people calculated that correctly." He paused. "We ran our own Numbers after reading the document. The margin was actually narrower than you stated. You needed integration in 8 member territories to activate the trigger. You achieved 11, I said. We prefer a margin where possible. He looked at me for a long moment with his wide flat eyes, then he made a gesture with his upper arms that I did not have a translation for, and he walked away. The third thing that happened was that a very young aide from the Marathi delegation, who I would estimate was in the early stage of whatever life cycle the Marathi had, came to my platform and asked in very careful translated Galactic standard whether the human delegation would be willing to share the mathematical framework they had used to calculate probe distribution coverage. Not the probe technology itself, not the architecture of the system, just the mathematics. I said I would pass the request to the appropriate people. She said, we have had a similar problem for 400 years, a different problem, a similar shape. I said, send us the details. Mathematicians love problems with similar shapes. She left with the expression of someone who had done something that surprised themselves. Fourth thing that happened was the one that mattered most to me personally. It happened approximately 90 minutes after the formal announcement, when the chamber had moved from the immediate shocked turbulence of the first hour into the slower, more deliberate turbulence of the second hour, the kind where beings begin to accept the changed reality and start the work of figuring out what to do within it. I was still at my platform. I had not moved. Petra had gone to make coffee and returned and was sitting beside me reading her tablet with the focused concentration of someone processing a very large number of messages all at once. The luminary speaker came to the platform. She came alone as she had during the recess, and she stood at the edge of it as the Kethvari representative had stood, with that quality of careful consideration that seemed common to beings who had been alive long enough to know the cost of saying the wrong thing. She looked at me for a moment, then she sat down, uninvited, in the chair on the other side of my desk. She said, I would like to understand something. I said, please. She said, you agreed with everything we said. You agreed with the aggression index. You agreed with the charges. You sat in that chamber for 4 hours and heard everything we have gathered about your species, all of it accurate, all of it damning by any reasonable standard. And you agreed with it. Why? I thought about that. I said, because it was true. She waited. I said, and because arguing against true things has never been a successful long-term strategy. You can win arguments against true things for a while. Eventually the truth reasserts. I was not there to win an argument. I was there to change the situation. Those are different objectives. She was quiet. For a moment, the light inside her shifted in that slow way, clouds crossing a sky from the inside. She said, the data showed us what you have done to each other. I said, yes. She said, it did not show us what you have survived. I said, no, it did not. The aggression index measures what was done. It does not measure what came after, what was rebuilt, what was learned, what refused over and over and over again to stay broken. She looked at me for a very long time, long enough that I became aware of the weight of it, the particular weight that comes from the attention of a being whose species has been observing the galaxy for longer than my species has had fire. She said, we have watched many species. We have Seen a great many end, some of them ended from outside, some of them ended from within. The ones that ended from within were not always the ones that seemed most likely to. Sometimes the ones that seemed most likely to survive their own nature were the ones that did not. I said, what kind did we seem like to you? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the kind we could not model. I said, yes, that is probably the most accurate thing anyone has said about us today. She stood up. She straightened the smoke-like material around her form. She said, the Luminari will not oppose the human delegation during the institutional review. I said, thank you. She said, I am not certain it is a gift. The review will be contentious. There are species on this council who will spend the next 3 to 7 years arguing every word of the addendum subclause. I said, we are comfortable with contentious. Something moved in her face. I still could not name it precisely, but it was warm. Whatever it was she left, Petra had put down her tablet and was looking at me. She said, did that just go the way I think it went? I said, the Luminari are going to stay out of the fight. She said, that's significant. I said, it's everything, because the Luminari were the oldest observational record. The council, their withdrawal from opposition, was not a political gesture. It was the closest thing available. The language of this institution to the oldest voice in the room saying, wait. Look again, we have seen more than the data shows. Other delegations had heard it. Other delegations would make their own calculations accordingly. I picked up my communicator. Still no response from Earth. 40 minutes each way. I had sent the message 90 minutes ago and would receive a reply in approximately 10 minutes. I thought about what the reply was going to be and what I was going to do with myself for the next 30 to 90 days while the preliminary review was established. I thought about Oruri Prime's delegate facilities, which were comfortable and well provisioned, but which did not have particular kind of silence that I had been looking forward to as the thing waiting for me on the other side of this day. I thought there is so much work left, and I thought, yes, good work was what we were built for. The communicator chimed. I looked at it. The reply from Earth was not from the Secretary General. It was from Nora. It said, Dad, everyone is screaming on the news and nobody is explaining anything properly. Are we okay? Also, can you come home now? I read it twice. Then I replied yes, and soon I set the communicator down. I looked at the chamber where 312 species were in the middle of the longest conversation they had collectively had in 600 years, trying to work out what they had just encountered and what to do about it and what it meant for everything that came next. I thought, this is where it starts, not the ending. The beginning of the very long, very complicated, very necessary conversation between humanity and the rest of the galaxy, which was going to be contentious and frustrating and full of procedural disputes and late nights in rooms that smelled of old metal and things I did not have words for, and which was going to produce over time something none of us could fully see yet, but which was already there, gathering, pressing together under its own weight, not visible yet, but building toward ignition. I thought about that nebula. I thought about what was in the dark that only looked empty. I thought, we are very good at dark places. We have been building things in them for a very long time. They kept us on Ori Prime for 63 days. Institutional review preliminary. Assessment required a minimum of 30 days and could extend to 90, and the council's legal staff, once they had recovered from the initial shock of having the addendum trigger activated for the first time in their institutional memory, moved with a thoroughness that I found genuinely impressive. They were, whatever else could be said about them, extremely good at procedure. They had been doing it for 10,000 years, and it showed. I spent those 63 days doing 3 things. The first was attending the formal preliminary review sessions, which occupied most of the working hours of most days and involved sitting in rooms considerably smaller than the grand convocation hall, with groups of legal representatives from various delegations and working through the exact language of the addendum clause word by word, and then working through it again from the other direction, and then arguing about it, and taking breaks and arguing about it. More, I had expected this to be tedious. It was in the way that any large and consequential argument is tedious when you are inside it, but it was also alive in a way that I had not anticipated. There was something extraordinary about watching 300 species of legal mind apply themselves to a document that most of them had never known existed. They found things in it that I had not found. They found implications that our researchers had not seen. Some of those implications were useful to us, some were not. All of them were interesting. The KTHvari legal team was the most formidable opponent. The room, as I had expected, they had been challenging council presidents for 4,000 years, and they were very good at it. Their lead representative, a younger Keith Vari, named something I could not pronounce correctly, and so translated as Advocate Gray, had a particular talent for finding the angle on any argument from which it looked weakest. She was patient, thorough, and completely without any personal animus, which made her more difficult to respond to than someone who was angry. On the 19th day, after a 6-hour session in which she had methodically taken apart the chain of legal reasoning, linking the probe integration threshold to the addendum trigger, I said to her during a break that she was very good at this. She said without any particular warmth, "Your researchers found the subclause. My job is to make sure the rest of the council understands exactly what it says and does not say." I said, "Is it possible they do both?" She looked at me. "What do you mean?" I said, "Is it possible that the subclause says what we say it says and also does not say some of the things we implied it might say? Both could be true. The review process would be served better by that kind of precision than by a binary outcome." She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "You are proposing a narrow reading that preserves the trigger but limits its scope." I said, "I am proposing an honest reading, which is, I think, what the review is for." She looked at me for a while longer, then she picked up her documentation and went back to her seat. On the 22nd day, the Kethvari legal team submitted a revised position paper that adopted a narrow reading of the addendum subclause. It preserved the trigger. It limited its application in ways that removed several of the broader implications our team had allowed to stand in the original document. It was, taken altogether, a more honest legal document than what we had submitted. I accepted the revisions. Petra thought I was giving away something valuable. I told her we were not in a negotiation. We were in a process that was going to produce the framework within which humanity would exist in this galaxy for the next several hundred years, and I would rather that framework be accurate than advantageous. She said, those aren't always different things, I said. In this case they are, an accuracy will serve us longer. The second thing I did during those 63 days was talk to people, not formally, not in sessions, during breaks, during the long evenings, in the delegate corridors, during the meals that the council provided in a common room where representatives from many different species ate their respective foods in whatever proximity they could manage. I talked to aides and junior researchers and the occasional senior delegate who stopped by a table where I was sitting with Petra. I asked questions, I listened to the answers, I took notes in my paper notebook, which continued to attract interest, and I accumulated a picture of the galaxy that was considerably more detailed and more complicated and more useful than the one I had arrived with. I learned that 3 of the species who had voted for quarantine had done so despite the private views of their senior scientific establishments, which had been for some years quietly of the opinion that isolating humanity was the wrong approach. Political cost, as I had always understood, was a real constraint. I learned that the Vithara had been looking for a reason to challenge the quarantine mechanism's legal basis for 200 years, not because of any particular feeling about humanity, but because they believed on structural grounds that the mechanism had accumulated too much unread power and needed the discipline of a contested case. They were grateful to us for providing one. They did not frame this as gratitude because the Vithara did not do gratitude, but the meaning was clear. I learned that the luminary speaker, whose name I could not render in any human phonetic system and whom I had taken calling by the name of her role, had been the most significant internal voice in the council, arguing against quarantine for 3 years before the formal assessment began. She had not voted against it because the vote count had not been close enough to make her dissent consequential, and she had calculated that her energy was better spent on what came after. She was, in other words, doing exactly what I had done, playing a longer game. I told her this during one of the common room evenings when we ended up at adjacent tables and she crossed the short distance between them to sit with me. She looked at me for a long moment when I said it, and then she produced a sound that I had not heard Illuminari make before, something between a resonance and a breath, in which Petra, sitting beside me later, said sounded exactly like a laugh. I learned that the young Marathi aide who had asked about the mathematical framework was part of a research team that had been trying for 400 years to solve a problem of resource distribution across star systems that their species occupied on a seasonal migration pattern. Their current models kept producing an instability at the 3rd generational interval. The problem, when she described it to me over 2 evenings and 3 sets of notes on paper I tore out of my notebook, was not actually a distribution problem. It was a feedback problem. I showed her where the instability was entering the system. She looked at the paper for a very long time. She said, "How did you see that so quickly?" I said, "Humans spend a lot of time looking at systems that keep producing instability at the 3rd generational interval. We have some practice." She took the paper back to her delegation. On the 41st day she came back to tell me that their Mathematics team had confirmed the correction and that their models rerun with the adjusted framework were stable through the 6th generational interval. She did not say thank you because the Marathi expressed appreciation through a physical gesture I could not reproduce. But she showed me the corrected models, and the quality of her attention while she showed them was a form of gratitude. I understood completely. The third thing I did during those 63 days was think about what came next, not strategically. Exactly, though strategy was part of it. More fundamentally than that, I thought about what it meant for humanity to be here in this process, engaged in this argument with all its frustrations and revelations and late evenings and paper notes and mathematical corrections and the specific smell of a common room where 12 different species were eating 12 different things and talking with a self-conscious awkwardness that slowly, over 63 days, became less self-conscious and more like people trying, I thought, about what it meant to be the species that the galaxy had been most afraid of and most dismissive of and most completely unprepared for. I thought about the probes floating in 11-star systems still dormant because the trigger had not been activated, and now, with the review underway, would not be. They would continue to float there indefinitely, patient and small and full of everything we were, until the council decided what to do about them. That decision was part of the review process. 2. Some delegations wanted them removed, some wanted them studied. Vithara characteristically wanted them formally catalogued as a precedent setting case in the council's legal archive. I had no particular view on what happened to the probes. They had served their purpose, which was not to transmit but to exist, to be the thing that made the quarantine unenforceable. Whether they ultimately stayed or went was a question for the people who would be navigating this process long after I went home, and I was going home. The preliminary review concluded on the 63rd day with a formal determination that the addendum trigger had been validly activated under council law as currently written, that the quarantine verdict against humanity was suspended pending full review completion, that the full review process would take no fewer than 3 years and no more than 7, and that the human delegation would be permitted to return to Earth with the understanding that a formal diplomatic presence on our prime would be required. Throughout the review period, Petra read the determination out loud to me in the small observation room where I had eaten the food I could not name on the first day of the recess over 2 months ago. Her voice was steady and careful and completely controlled until she reached the final line, which stated that during the review period all interstellar travel restrictions on human registered vessels were suspended pending the outcome. Her voice did not break, but there was a pause before she continued. That was longer than the punctuation required. I understood. I did not say anything. The next morning I sent a full report to Geneva. It took me 4 hours to write and was substantially longer than any single document I had produced in my diplomatic career. I sent it through the secure relay, and I did not try to summarize it because it could not be summarized without losing things that mattered. Then I packed my bag. It was not a large bag. I had arrived with very little, and I was leaving with very little, plus a paper notebook that was completely full and which I intended to keep for the rest of my life. Petra came to say goodbye. She was staying on Ori Prime as the senior human diplomatic liaison for the review period, which would involve exactly the kind of sustained, methodical, patient procedural work that she was extraordinarily good at. I told her this. She said she knew. She said it without false modesty, because she genuinely did know, and because we had been working together long enough that false modesty between us would have been an insult. She said, "Do you think the review goes the way we need it?" I thought about that. I said, "I think 3 years is long enough for a lot of things to change." She said, "That's not an answer." I said, "It's the honest one." She looked at me for a moment, then she held out her hand and I shook it, and she said, "Go see your daughter." I went. The transport from Ori Prime to the nearest relay point took 9 hours. From the relay point to the inner system took another 4 days. I slept for most of them, not because I was particularly tired, but because my body had apparently decided that it had been carrying something at a very high level of tension for a very long time, and it was going to take the first available opportunity to set it down. I thought in the hours I was awake about the 63 days and about the 3 years to come, and about all the specific difficulties of being a species that the galaxy's oldest institution was in the process of learning to make room for, when it had not originally left any room at all. I thought about Dara. He had not come to speak to me again after our private meeting. He had attended the review sessions, and he had been, as always, composed and thorough and formidably difficult to argue with. He had not treated me as an enemy. He had treated me as a variable that he was still, after 63 days, in the process of fully categorizing. I suspected he would be in that process for some time. I thought that was probably healthy for both of us. I thought about the Luminari speaker who had told me they could not model us. I thought that was possibly the most important thing anyone had said in that entire process, not as a compliment, not as a threat, simply as an observation, a thing that cannot be modeled, cannot be planned for, in the way that things which can be modeled are planned for. That was uncomfortable for the council. It was also in a way that I found difficult to articulate, but believed completely, the thing that gave us the most real claim to place among them. The galaxy had 10,000 years of stable, mapped, carefully modeled civilizations. It had an almost perfect record of knowing in advance what each of them would do, and then it had us. We were the variable that wouldn't stabilize, the species that kept producing outcomes nobody had calculated. We were, by every formal measure the council had, the most dangerous thing they had encountered. We were also, and I believe this as completely as I had ever believed anything, exactly what they needed, not because we were better, not because we were wiser, because we were different in ways that the galaxy, after 10,000 years of careful soulsness, had run out of the capacity to generate from within itself, because we asked questions that nobody had thought to ask, and we broke things that had stopped working but that nobody had noticed had stopped working, because they had been in place for so long, and we walked through doors that everyone else had agreed were walls. That was not comfortable. It was not clean. It was not going to make the next 100 years easy for anyone, including us, but it was real, and it was present, and it was not going anywhere. We had made certain of that on the last day of the transit, as the ship entered the inner system and the navigation display began showing the familiar shapes of home. I took out my notebook and I read Through the notes I had made over the 63 days, all of it, every session, every conversation, every name I had learned to approximate, every mathematical problem discussed over torn notebook paper, every silence that had said something I needed to remember. Then I closed the notebook and I looked at the display. I watched the third planet appear. I watched it grow from a small point of blue-green light into something with visible shape, visible detail, visible cloud cover moving in the patterns I had been looking at from the ground my entire life. I thought 8 billion people going about there Tuesday, not knowing that 63 days ago their future changed in a small room on a space station very far away, in a conversation between a human diplomat who had not shaken once and the oldest governing body in the known galaxy over a piece of paper that nobody in that body had bothered to update in 7,000 years. I thought that is the most human story I have ever heard. I thought we did not conquer the galaxy. We did not have to. We found the door that nobody had remembered to lock. We walked through it. We stayed. And now the galaxy was going to have to learn to live with that, and we were going to have to learn to live with the galaxy. And it was going to be hard and slow and full of late evenings in rooms that smelled of old metal, and it was going to be the most extraordinary thing our species had ever done. Not the ultimatum, not the probes, not the 63 days of procedure. What came after the long, difficult, genuine, necessary work of belonging somewhere that had not initially wanted you. We were, as it turned out, very good at that. We had been practicing for 1,000